Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started shortly. I'm just checking the time and it's 12:15. So we're looking at just making sure that all of our participants that have registered for today's webinar can join. So I'll give it maybe a minute or two, and then we will get started. You should see a screen with a PowerPoint presentation in front of you and a video screen of myself. My name's Ali. I'm here at the National Trust. And I guess just before we get going too, I'll draw your attention to the chat feature that's built into Zoom, our interface here for webinars. If you have any technical issues, you can go ahead and type it in the chat feature and we will do our best to get you going and figure out how to help you. Okay, so it looks like we have most of our participants joining us today, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is the webinar for practical approaches to heritage home rehabilitation. So a quick introduction to the National Trust. For those of you who are not familiar, the National Trust is a national charity. We are located here in Ottawa, but we work with communities and individuals across the country, and we really work to lead and inspire action for places that matter and helping people save their historic places and work with them to bring new life to those places. This webinar is specifically offered through our Regeneration Works program. I'll talk a little bit more about Regeneration Works at the end of this webinar, but you can find us on our website and click through and learn more about what Regeneration Works is, as well as our membership and what we offer. So this is the first time the National Trust is putting on a webinar directed at homeowners. So we are really eager to hear your feedback. So as I mentioned, there's a chat box. So if anybody has questions, technical issues, feel free to use the chat box. But if you also are interested in learning more about a certain topic, feel free to type in any theme or subject area that you are interested in learning more about. We will capture all of that after this webinar and hopefully put together a proposal of how we can go forward and share more of this information with you. Also on that note, post-webinar, we will send out a survey where we capture and collect everybody's feedback on the information that we have shared with you today. So if you could fill out the survey, again, because this is a new topic for us, we would really like to hear your feedback and get some direction on where we can go from here. As for questions, we have a pretty jam-packed series today. So if you have a question, you can type it in the chat box and we will see if we have time to get to it at the end. If it's a super specific question, we probably won't cover it in today's webinar. This is more of an introduction style webinar. It's going to be a conversation between myself and Paul. So if we can't get to your very specific question, we will log it. If you want to contact us and reach out to us afterwards, we will be happy to try our best to answer your question. But some of those questions that are more applicable to everyone, we will try and see if we have time at the end of our webinar to answer them for everyone for everyone. Okay, so I guess we will get started. On today's agenda, we will do some brief introductions so that you know who you are listening to. And then we're going to go into a few different topics. Some questions had been emailed in prior to this webinar, so I've done my best to try and incorporate them into some of these topics. But again, like I said, if you have other questions, feel free to type them in the chat box throughout the webinar or email us after and we will do our best to respond. So identifying elements to protect is the first topic we're going to look at. Then reusing what you already have is the second topic. The third one is common challenges in renovating historic homes. The fourth one is getting advice and finding a professional. And then if we have time for questions, we will do them there. And then a few closing remarks and wrapping up today's session. So to start off, we'll jump right into introductions. My name is Ali Pivovar. I am the Regeneration Project Manager here at the National Trust for Canada. A little bit about me. I finished my Master's of Architecture degree at Carleton University in 2015. My master's thesis looked at the adaptive reuse of wooden crib grain elevators in Saskatchewan, which is my home province. And ever since then, I've just been so intrigued by heritage buildings and the stories they tell. So I joined Heritage Conservation Services, which is through the federal government. And I spent 3.5 years there working on heritage buildings designated at the federal level and national historic sites across the country, everything from forts to barns to lighthouses, office buildings, really everything. And I learned a lot about the technical applications about adaptive reuse and rehabilitation. And I joined the National Trust in January of this past year and have been working more at a community level and really helping people find new uses and save the places that matter to them. I'm an intern architect, so I'm working towards my license to practice architecture, and I'm really interested in this topic as well, and especially finding practical approaches, so things that you may not have thought about as a heritage homeowner, but that you're able to implement in a way that's tangible. So without further ado, I will introduce our guest presenter today, Paul Denise, who is a designer, renovator, and owner of Denise Builds Designs. So Paul, I will get you to unmute your microphone and then you can introduce yourself and a little bit of history about you.
Can you hear me, Ali?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I'd like to thank you, Ali, and the National Trust for inviting me here today to speak on a thing that's very close to my heart, which is heritage homes. I think I've been doing this at least 35 years, and I like to think I could do it full-time, but it's not a full-time occupation for me because we don't get very many opportunities, so usually because restoration is less than 1% of all construction activity. But I'm glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to doing something or discussing something that's very close to my heart.
Great. Paul, could you give us a little bit of background on what kind of projects you've worked on, residential, commercial, anything like woodworking? I know you have experience in carpentry. Just give us a background on some of the projects you've experienced.
Okay, so in terms of a heritage market, I'm a licensed carpenter, but when we talk about heritage, I mainly deal with residential structures. We've done a few commercial pieces, but mainly residential pieces. Anything from porches to windows to plaster inside a heritage home, flooring, you name it, we've probably done it. Okay, we've done several heritage projects in the city of Ottawa with. Along with their grant system there, and I've won some awards through their awards, heritage awards. So that's what I am also known for too. Okay.
So Paul is, you work mostly in Ottawa, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we will jump right into it. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off so you can see the PowerPoint full screen. And okay, so the first topic is identifying elements to protect. So now when I think about elements to protect, I think about both interior and exterior elements, everything from porches to fireplaces to hardwood floors, roofs, everything that really goes into a building and that has that era that reflects when the building was built. So I think the first area that maybe Paul can dive into a little bit for us is how do you know what elements are important, and how do you identify which elements would be protected through any sort of rehabilitation project?
When we talk about heritage restoration, we're really talking about building stock that's I would say 1950, just before the big building boom after the war. And most of those houses are not what we call production-built homes. They're really one-of-a-kind homes. Like an itinerant builder built one home at a time. They're not mass-produced. So simply by clear observation, by walking around, you're going to notice moldings, and you're going to notice fireplaces, as you mentioned, or tile. They're really unique that you can't find anywhere else. Okay, and that poses some of its challenges in terms of restoration. But I think when we talk about the history of architecture or art or anything like that, when things are mass produced, they tend to somehow lose their value or people's appreciation for it. And I think that's one thing that attracts me to heritage restoration, is that these are one-of-a-kind items that I'm restoring or rehabilitating. You know, it's like if you're buying a piece of furniture at Leon's, it could be one of 10,000 pieces in Canada, or if you buy an antique, it could be one of 4 in the world. So I think that's the different dichotomies between the different types of architecture and looking for, you know, elements that you need to restore. Most of these houses have unique moldings, unique fabric that you won't find readily anywhere else.
Okay, great. Do you have any tips or tricks to identify maybe an element that was added at a later date versus something that could be original to the house?
A key indicator in something like that is the layers of paint on it. When we're obviously, like the example that you have on the up on the presentation is a porch. We often look how much buildup of paint. If the paint is globby and the molding detail is not as crisp and new, we know that is original to the house just by the number of layers of paint, and so sort of tells us that, you know, this has got to be original to the house, basically.
Yeah. Now, on the topic of porches and maybe looking at this one specifically, I'm wondering how you choose paint colors or colors that are reflective of the period, but that give it this new, brighter life compared to what, if we look at the previous image of what this porch looked like before the restoration. How did you go ahead and choose those colors?
A lot of the paint companies will have historic paint colors in research, but also there's a lot of stuff on the web showing you historic colors. I know many of them spend lots of money just to find the historic colors. If you know the age of the house, you can find an historic palette that would celebrate the architecture. I often, when people have pieces like this, I often call it buried treasure, because beforehand, someone painted it all black. It didn't really celebrate, you know, the look and the feel of the porch or the different elements that were involved in the porch. And by just accenting colors like you see on the right, it sort of now makes it pop. Like now it's 3-dimensional. Now it's a little bit more, you know, I really know what's going on there. Okay.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to needing to, for example, if a corbel was missing or if there was a missing element, what's the best approach to either finding a new one or building a new one? Like, how do you find or locate and add a new element that's potentially missing on a front porch or a cornice of a building?
I know in the Ottawa area, we do have a couple of suppliers that will cut knives for moldings and stuff along those lines. Often we will be making it ourselves sometimes with the scroll work there. The other thing that we've done in the past is if we're looking for a small section of molding inside the house that's missing on a door frame or something like that, sometimes we'll harvest from the closet and put it out in a more focal and open public place, and then make some, if we at a later date maybe do a run to do a reproduction molding for the inside of the closet or something along those lines. Sometimes we're missing hardwood, or we have a damaged piece of hardwood in the other parts of the house, so sometimes we will be harvesting from the closet, and maybe we'll get a better blend of the, when the floor is sanded, it'll disappear more than trying to use a fresher piece of wood, if you know what I'm saying. So looking for original fabric in the house that we can repurpose somewhere else is one choice. A lot of the stuff you do not get from Home Depot or a big building box store place. You have to really reproduce them one at a time, basically, and that's about the only approach you can take to it, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So now talking about specific materials that you find in these houses. Now, I know you have quite a background working in carpentry and woodwork, but there's lots of other elements that we find in historic houses, masonry, whether it's brick or stone or even marble, metals, perhaps in grills, radiators, that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about the value of some of those materials and why they would be important to retain in a restoration project?
Yeah, because a lot of those other materials are of a certain scale or feel. Often, I just finished working on a house downtown Ottawa this summer, and they had been missing a lot of the heat registers or grills or cast iron grills. And fortunately, on Kijiji, we could find someone was selling them. You'd be surprised. One of the unique things about these older houses is sometimes I have an easier time finding heat register or elements for houses like this on Kijiji compared to compared to brand new elements or stuff that from the 60s or 70s. These houses, this housing stock is if you take a look at all the housing stock in Canada, 50% of our housing stock is almost 100 years old or more, okay? And so there is a prevalence as some of these places get torn down. You might be able to find them at, there are people doing architectural salvage. So you may be able to, I know there's several places in Ontario that have these type of places where they warehouse older materials that you can go back and get. I've often gone to these places to source things like original front doors that have very sculptural moldings on them, and it's a lot cheaper to buy a salvage door and install it in an opening than have it reproduced from scratch, where we're saving probably 2/3 of the cost of the door when we use an original antique door in the opening rather than making a brand new one, basically.
Now, when you're talking about things like doors, are you able to do certain modifications to the door, whether it be add a glass panel or resize it, things like that, to make a new salvaged element fit a new purpose in a rehabilitation project?
Yeah. A lot of the time when we're sizing doors, we can find the exact size that fits in the opening. We usually don't have too much of a problem, but sometimes as you mentioned, Ali, we have to modify it. I know of one project I did for a client that on the presentation, on the front of the presentation, or what you posted on the website for this seminar, it was that particular project. He had a steel front door, and we actually sourced a wood door for his front door, along with an old style wood deadbolt lock. And these are actual antiques from 100 plus years ago that we installed in it. And because the house had gone through a renovation, I guess in the 70s, and someone put a steel door, and it just doesn't feel right. It's just sort of this major architectural disconnect that just doesn't feel right on the building. The comment that we always get from our clients once we've done a lot of this restoration work is just, it looks like it did the day it was built, and it just feels right when we put it back together with the right massing, the right material. It just feels right when we do this.
Okay, I think that's a perfect segue to our next slide, which is talking about reusing what you already have. Now, we talked about having to sometimes source new elements, but I know you have some expertise on wood windows and rehabilitating those. Could you share with us, I guess, a little bit about why you would do restore an old window rather than replace it?
Windows have a special place for me because they're an element of the historic fabric that's very easy to get working again. With about an investment of about 2 to 3 hours, we can weather strip these windows. We can get them functioning brand new like the day they were put in. A lot of people, there's little tricks like waxing the guides that the double hungs go in, and reconnecting sash cords. There's a little secret pocket door on most double hung windows people are not aware of. And the other reason why I feel these are elements worth investing time in is these windows can last, some claims people are claiming anywhere from 200 to 500 years. Now, when we weather strip these windows, we found, and I belong to an association in the States called the Window Preservation Alliance, and we found that these windows can be just as airtight and energy efficient as a brand new modern window within 5% of the same energy efficiency. The problem with modern windows nowadays, when we rip out these older windows and replace them with modern thermal panes, the big Achilles heels of a modern window is its thermal pane. Most thermal panes, or which is a insulated glass, which is 2 panes of glass are glued together with a spacer and some caulking. The thermal pane has a lifespan of about 25 years. And some of the plastic windows or PVC windows last about that long before the plastic starts to get brittle. And so what we are finding now through the association, that people who invest in brand new modern windows are into this debt cycle of 25 to 35 years of replacing these windows, because by the time 25 years has passed, we no longer can find the cords or the hardware for that window to repair it if the springs no longer work on it. The one great thing about heritage windows is I have easier times finding the hardware for heritage windows than I do for current modern windows, which to me, it doesn't make a very resilient choice if you're going to replace something with something and it won't have the legs to last that decent amount of time.
And when it comes to hardware, you mentioned, sourcing new hardware, but I think you've also done some work on restoring old hardware, whether it be taking paint layers off and making it functioning again. Could you talk a little bit about hardware for doors and windows?
So for doors and windows, we've done, there's a lot of reproduction hardware in the States that are available to us. And if we can't find it there, we did a project on the Quebec side, because we're very close to the Quebec border here, where they had this unique window pull. There was a person not too far from us in Merrickville that actually they cast bronzed the window pull for us. And we were able to recast it and get new ones made for them. So there are several. It's not a lost cost. There are resources available to restore these windows quite easily and affordably, I believe.
So if you're a homeowner and you wanted your contractor to help you restore your windows, I mean, does every contractor know how to approach this, or are you looking for a contractor with specific expertise?
Yeah, I know with our Window Preservation Alliance, we have a list of recommended contractors that specialize in this skill. It's not a skill that every contractor has. It's not like we, again, because of the demand of it, there's a few committed people that do this type of work, but there's not like there's a large body of them, but it's just a matter of more sourcing them. And Google's our friend nowadays, so they should be easy to find on the web. If they're committed, they should have a website, talking about what they do, basically.
Okay, great. Now, sticking with wood, but changing from windows. Now, lots of old old historic homes have beautiful hardwood floors, but sometimes they're either covered in paint or in pretty bad shape. What are some of your experiences doing restoration on hardwood floors, whether it be needing to fill in holes or getting off some epoxy or really hard paint? Do you have any thoughts that you can share with homeowners on hardwood floor restoration?
Hardwood floor restorations is done quite a bit. I mean, most floor refinishers can resand a floor. A lot depends on how many sandings it's gone through already, because sometimes if it's been sanded, the more owners in a building, obviously the more chances that floor is going to be sanded. And even with 3/4 inch hardwood flooring, you really only have a 1/4 inch of wear layer on a 3/4 inch floor. So you only have, somewhere around 8 to 12 sandings that you can get out of that floor before you start hitting the nail heads for the floor installation, basically. So, but you can do it. It's not like you can't do it. Often, if there's forced air heating in the house and there's floor grills, you can see the thickness of the floor and see how many times it's been sanded. And again, we mentioned this already, but if we're looking for low localized repairs, using the original material from the house will give you the most seamless repair that you can get. And so sometimes we're harvesting from closets and then maybe using a similar, the same size hardwood floor, but newer material in the closet where it's not as visible, if you know what I'm saying.
Well, that makes sense. So you would cut out the original floor from the closet and add it to somewhere where it's more obvious, say in a kitchen or a living room, and then
room in the middle of the living room.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That makes sense. Now, when it comes to stairs, I know typically whenever I walk into a historic house, the stairs are probably one of the most beautiful elements if they haven't been destroyed over time. But looking at the newel posts and the handrail details and the spindles, can you talk a little bit about why you would want to retain original stairs and what goes into some of that restoration work?
Do you want to go to the next slide, Ali? That's a perfect example, segue into the next slide. Oh, there we go. So that railing you see right there are reproductions of a salvage piece that the client found at a architectural salvage place. This house was a two-story apartment at one time, and so they had to remove the original handrail that went down the stairs there, and so we re-implemented the elements to work back to where it was originally. So looking again at architectural salvage places around the same vintage of the house, often I ask people to look in the attics or in the basement or in the crawl spaces. Sometimes some of the elements are kicking around there, and it gives us a clue, that what was originally there. So often looking there in those places around the property, you might find some of the original elements. These are expensive elements because they have to be made one at a time by a wood turner. They're not something that's production made when there's 10,000 spindles being made. So they tend to be a little bit more costly, but it can be done. And when we do it, people say it just feels right again. It feels like the right scale. It just makes the house feels whole again, if you know what I'm saying. Has a little bit of a holistic approach to it.
Yes, of course. It's beautiful to see that railing, knowing that it wasn't there even before. It looks, like you said, it looks seamless. It looks like as if it has always been there and had just been restored. So it's great to know that you can get salvaged pieces and implement them in a way that makes it feel like it's been there forever.
Yeah.
So I guess on the topic of stairs, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was one of the common challenges is meeting new codes and we'll talk about accessibility in a little bit, but from your experiences, what are some of the challenges related to stairs and codes that homeowners face when they're trying to do rehabilitation?
Often the pre-existing railing heights, or what we call guard heights in the code, are below what the current standards are right now. So sometimes it's the way I've done it in the past, and we don't have an example up here online, but I'm known for a heavy, drippy Victorian porch that we restored from a photograph down on St. Patrick Street, and the original guard height was much too low to satisfy today's code. So what we implemented was a use of a modern material like a stainless steel bar up 6 inches above the original guard height to make the guard conform to it, basically. And the other issue we have sometimes when you have an asymmetrical design or a lot of horizontal elements in a guard, it facilitates climbing. So sometimes you have to sort of put either a glass panel in front of that limits the ability for a foot to access these horizontal members, so no one would be able to climb up and over the guards, basically. So that's some of the tricks that we've used in the past to make a guard conform. When we say guard, we mean railing.
Yeah. I'm interested to know a little bit more about why you chose to do like a metal piece in addition to what I assume would have been a wooden railing. Why would you choose a change of materials? And could you kind of explain how it worked, what worked in terms of financial perspective and introducing a new element, but also the aesthetic character and how that kind of new layer impacted the existing heritage fabric?
So when we had this photograph, if we changed the guard height by raising the top railing up higher or another 6 inches or putting another wood element, it wouldn't sort of be, it would change the look and composition of the original intention of the design of the architect. And by just introducing like a stainless steel railing, it's saying, okay, this is a new element. It's not part of the old, it's new. But, and the other part why we chose stainless was it's a very neutral material, and you sort of don't reconcile it as part of the porch. You sort of feel separate and distinct. One of the interesting conditions on this two-story porch is that the first floor never had a railing, and it needed a guard to qualify to conform to the code. And so on the lower portion, since it never had a spindled railing, we just end up using glass and stainless there, so that it would not impact on the overall appearance of the porch, basically. It sort of just blends, it sort of melts away and blends in the background. Your eyes don't really perceive it as a fully formed part of the composition, basically.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point to note, is that when new interventions happen to historic buildings, it's important that while some things can be salvaged, for example, finding these spindles and newel posts for the stairs, other things that are new should be of its time and reflect a new layer to the building and tell a story that this is a new element, it wasn't original. I find just from my experience looking at historic sites, lots of times that story is very clear, but if you're not paying attention to it, you may not notice. So I guess when it comes to homeowners and thinking about, practical things that they could do for their house, maybe they don't necessarily always have to go to a salvage and find that old material. It could be a contemporary addition that doesn't impact the heritage character, but that still meets its new purpose.
No, I wholeheartedly agree, Ali. Like, I mean, when you can imagine when you do the adaptive reuse, if you have to put a ramp for accessibility, the ramp doesn't have to be a heavy, drippy Victorian ramp, because back then they didn't make heavy, drippy Victorian ramps. You're probably going to put it in a more modern context, a more modern material, but still it obeys and respects the original intention of the historic home, basically.
That's a good segue to an accessibility conversation. How have you had to implement ramp design on traditional front porches? Have you done it at the front of buildings? Is it more appropriate at the back of buildings? Could you talk a little bit about how you've approached accessibility issues?
I haven't done a lot in that type of field, but as I mentioned before, you can make it out of a material that's separate and different and distinct. It doesn't have to be of the same, of the original fabric, basically, because it was never a choice back then. No one was making ramps back then.
Right.
But I've seen ramps made with helical piles, which are metal foundational posts that can be removed at a later date. Okay, so it leaves you the flexibility as the building ages and as the needs and demands of that building change for the occupant. You can have the flexibility with that choice by these helical piles go in quite affordably, and we often use them for foundational issues on porches and on the foundation of an older structure also. But they, if you say you don't need the ramp at the back anymore, you can unwind them out of the ground and use them somewhere else.
So now I think that's an interesting perspective, because we talked about, more architectural elements being of new and of its time, but now we're talking about helical piles, which are a new structural material of its time.
Yeah.
It kind of bridges me into another area that I wanted to ask you about, was when you're opening up walls. I know lots of people like the open concept idea now in living dining areas. When you're opening up, your typical lath and plaster walls, and studs that may or may not be load bearing to the floor above, are there ways of introducing, I guess, does new structural interventions need to be old, or can they also be new?
They can also be new. I think the biggest issue is finding a structural engineer that's comfortable with older buildings. The one thing about historic homes, what they have to their advantage is they have the test of time. They've been there 100 years. A lot of these historic homes were really built before there was a formalized building code. And so they were just rules of thumbs with itinerant builders, that type of thing, but nothing formally where the city would inspect or anything along those lines. But yet they may be understructured somewhat, but they still are standing up. They're not falling down around our ears. They haven't moved in 100 years. Usually anything if you look at a 100-year-old home today, it's probably whatever it's going to structural failure or any structural issues or any failures, it would have already happened in this last 100 years. So one of the things that I found out about heritage homes from a fire perspective, because they're made out of thicker, more solid wood, it takes a 100-year-old home a good 2 to 3 hours to burn to the ground, where it takes a modern home less than 10 minutes to burn to the ground.
Wow.
So I found this out through a firefighter, and a lot of times when you have a modern home, the firefighters aren't going in to do anything. They're just there to put out the fire. In a 100-year-old home, you can actually, if it goes through a catastrophic fire, it can be salvaged a lot more than a modern home.
Now, I guess thinking about like sprinkler systems and that kind of thing in more commercial buildings, have you done any work on sprinklers or fire safety?
I haven't done anything on sprinklers or fire safety in a commercial building, but one of the elements of or historic fabric of a 100-year-old home, the walls are lath and plaster. And the plaster in these 100-year-old homes is an early form of cement. So basically, you have cement walls in a 100-year-old home, which are more, I feel, way more fireproof than a drywall construction, because it's thick, it takes a longer time to burn, that type of stuff. So I think that's what helps increase the time for egress out of a building, is if it takes longer to burn, you have more chance to get out of it, basically. So I think that's why they are a little more fire resistant than modern homes, basically.
That makes sense. Okay, so we're going to move into the last topic. But before I do, I just wanted to, again, encourage anybody that has questions. We might have, 5 minutes to go over some questions. If anybody has them, they can feel free to type them in the chat box. But otherwise, we'll just go on to the last topic, which we've kind of touched on throughout the webinar today. But when it comes to getting advice and finding a professional, Paul, do you have any recommendation for homeowners of where they could, find those professionals that could undertake the work and know how to approach certain restoration projects?
Starting with your city heritage department, they will have some experience or a list of contractors that have done work for a part of the heritage grant system. If your city does have a heritage grant system, as I mentioned before, you always look for Google reviews in Google. I know in this part of the province we have a heritage trades campus down in Perth from Algonquin, but I think that's a good place to start. Anybody that's is passionate and committed to this trade will be advertising on their website and hopefully getting reviews too. But I think that's probably a good place to start. I don't know if you have any other recommendations, Ali, yourself?
I would just like to touch quickly on the fact that there's the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, CAP. They also have a database of the members in their organization. So you can find anybody from historians to architects to engineers. And you can sort based on geography and types of buildings. So just a little bit of if you wanted to go to the CAP website, that's the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. That could also help you as you get going on some of the projects on your heritage homes. We did have one question come in. I think we'll touch on it briefly. I think it would probably be applicable to most people. But Paul, could you talk a little bit about insulating exterior walls, and if that's needed, how would you go about doing it? Or if it's not needed, why?
Okay, so in a 100-year-old house, it has a certain type of, most commonly has a certain type of framing. It's called balloon framing, where there's a stud bay cavity that goes from the first floor to the second floor completely open. But that's not to say that all heritage homes are built that way. There's another form of building called solid masonry, where you have little or no insulation space to make the house warmer or upgrade. But what I see commonly done is blowing in cellulose into 100-year-old homes. And what blowing in cellulose is basically shredded newspaper that's been mixed up with borates, which is a wood preservative and an insecticide and a slight fire retardant at the same time. As we go forward in terms of building, we were talking about deep energy retrofits, and a lot depends on someone's commitment to property. I see the question here is, what's the highest insulation value I can get into my cavity? Is it necessary to remove the lath and plaster? If you're committed to that home for the next 60 years, you may want to go down that road to get as much energy savings as possible. But there are other methods that we can use, like blown in cellulose, that will get you there. I think that the key thing when we're looking for energy reduction, we have to plug the holes. So a lot can be done by weather stripping the windows to be limiting the air loss through the windows. At the bottom of baseboards, there's a little quarter round molding you can remove, and you can put caulking in there to stop the hot, heated, expensive air leaking to the outside. So once we get the air tightness in the house, then we also look at upgrading the thermal value of the envelope at the same time. Would be also good, but eliminating air loss is key to saving energy.
That's great, Paul. I'm just looking at the time, and I know we're supposed to wrap up at 1. We've had a few other questions come in, but what I'm going to suggest is that if you have questions, if you could email them, or actually, when you get the post-event survey, if you could include your questions in the survey, that would really help us here at the National Trust try and make sure that our next webinars are able to respond to some of those questions. It sounds like we're all eager to learn more about the technical side of rehabilitating historic homes. So hopefully we will be able to put together some more. As we wrap up today, I just wanted to briefly touch on the fact that the National Trust is encouraging any new participants in this webinar to become members. We're actually offering a discount today, 30% discount on new members if you use this code, new member. There's numerous benefits of becoming a member of the National Trust. You'll get our National Trust magazine locale, discounts on our conference every year, and we actually have partnerships with international destinations around the world. So if you become a National Trust member, it gets you into national historic sites in other countries as well. You can check out our website to become a member, and the last thing is just about Regeneration Works. I mentioned it briefly at the beginning today, but our Regeneration Works program has webinars at about once a month about different topics. So if you're interested in learning more about what we do and what our resources are, definitely check out the Regeneration Works website on the National Trust page, and you can get some more information from there. And just to wrap up, I just wanted to thank Paul very much for joining us today and sharing his expertise with us. I learned a lot, and I'm hoping that all of our new homeowners that have found us here at the National Trust found it useful, and we hope to be interacting with you all again very shortly. So thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Ali.
And we will sign off. So everybody have a great afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us.